Factual Reset, a podcast brought to you by the New Political Economy Initiative at IIT Bombay. From India's industrial shifts to lessons from the world over, our host for the season, Srinivasan Iyer, is unpacking the historical blueprints, the breakthroughs, and the contemporary bold lessons that reset our thinking on the economy.
We have with us Amit Basole, who teaches economics at the Azim Premji University and heads the Center for Sustainable Employment. Welcome, Amit.
Thanks for having me.
Can we begin with how you would define industrial policy in India?
So industrial policy, the term, whether it applies to India or indeed any other countries, generally used to refer to a set of policies to do with supporting specific sectors or types of industries in an economy to help them grow. Now, the specific ways in which these policies appear, that depends, it can change from country to country, but very commonly they take the shape of subsidies, for example, which are targeted to certain sectors or subsectors. One can also include tax-related policies, tax waivers, or things like that. Land-related policies could come in there too. For example, special economic zones, these set of policies. And finally, also trade type of policies. So we'll come to that possibly in detail later, but tariffs and quotas and other things, all of which are ways of enabling certain specific types of industries or sectors to grow faster than they already are growing.
At this current juncture, what do you think are the main objectives of industrial policy in India?
The way I see it, the big aim of industrial policy in India today is no different than what has been the aim of industrial policy through history indeed, going in fact all the way back to in the origins of modern industrial capitalism in Europe, and which is to deliberately transform the structure of the economy by promoting sectors that are higher productivity, by improving their competitiveness and so on, and essentially aiding the structural transformation of the economy. So India is currently undergoing a structural transformation, as are many other developing countries, and the aim of industrial policy is to achieve that structural transformation.
In terms of some of the more highly visible policy instruments, such as the production-linked investment and their focus on and media discussion on high-tech industries, as well as some middle skill sectors, how would you assess the potential for India's industrial policy to deliver on its objectives given current global conditions, which includes friendshoring, which includes the rise to dominance of globally mobile capital, which includes a movement in technology where capital replaces labor, and more?
So this is an important point because this goes to demonstrating that even if on the face of it, the particular policies that constitute industrial policy may remain the same over decades or indeed centuries. And again, we are talking about credit subsidies, tax rebates, quotas, tariffs, all these kinds of things. Even though on the face of it they may remain the same, the underlying challenges do change quite a bit. And you've referred to a few of those. So as India tries to undertake industrial policy today, it does not face the same global environment that China did when it was doing its own industrial policy, let's say in the 1980s. And China was not facing the same conditions as Korea might have 10 or 15 years before that, and so on. Going all the way back to every successful wave of industrializer. So every wave of late industrializer faces its own challenges given the structure of the global economy. The most important of which you alluded to, one is automation. artificial intelligence and the kind of runaway process of automation, which is now far more profound and deep than it used to be even a few decades ago. Of course, the mobility of capital, and relatedly, the policy space that a country has to pursue its own independent agenda, which may not at times align with the agenda of either global finance capital or advanced industrialized countries or what have you. So again, we can go into a little bit more details on this, but to take one example, if there is a deglobalization trend in the rich countries where there's a return to protectionism or a public a public movement to scale back the integration of, let's say, a rich country into the global economy because of fear of loss of jobs, etc., over there, then that impacts the ability of poor countries or developing countries to undertake, let's say, policies that promote their own integration into the global economy. And industrial policy is partly about that integration because a central aim of industrial policy is to make those industries that you're targeting competitive with respect to the global economy. And now if there is a deglobalization trend coming in, then you're not really, you don't have the access to the markets that maybe your predecessors had. So that's a new challenge again. So whether it's automation, whether it's finance capital and its mobility, whether it's deglobalization trends, each age, I think, carries its own set of challenges which will determine whether the same sort of playbook will work as did earlier. You know, you look at South Korea and say, okay, they did this, so we could do this, or will it not work?
Thanks, Amit. Let us now turn to domestic conditions. How would you assess the potential for the success of industrial policy given your analysis of domestic conditions? And I want to draw attention specifically to at least two of these conditions. One, in the recent past, there has been much discussion about rising inequality, particularly post-COVID K-shaped recovery. In fact, that's showing up in the demand, for example, in automobile sector. How does that affect the prospects of industrial policy? The second is the nature of Indian capital, the nature of ownership of capital, the dominance of large business houses, and however else you may seek to understand that side of the story. Against this context and more about domestic conditions, how would you assess the potential for success?
I think this points to the necessity to think about industrial policy in a much broader way than I think generally we do. The general understanding of industrial policy is, again, what set of policies should the government do to improve competitiveness in a particular sector? We would like this sector to grow. For whatever reason that may be. Generally, it's a limited reason of export competitiveness and so forth, but you can broaden it to, let's say, creating employment. But really, industrial policy has the power to do a lot more, depending on how it is designed and executed. So coming to the two things that you mentioned, inequality we have seen rise steadily, in fact, in many countries in the last few decades. And it has different consequences which all have a bearing on industrial policy. So the first thing is that inequality changes the pattern of demand in the economy. So demand grows among those groups which, of course, see the fastest rise in incomes. And if that's a relatively well-to-do group that is seeing its incomes rise, then it's the demand for their type of consumption that is rising much faster. And that either tends to be import intensive or capital intensive, setting aside personal services, etc., which also rise. But certainly import intensive and capital intensive demand rises when inequality rises. And that has implications for how many jobs will be created for a given amount of growth. So India's jobs problem partly comes from there. So inequality is connected to the jobs problem. The inability of growth to translate into employment. And what does industrial policy, what can it do there is the big question. So a standard prescription here would be that industrial policy should target relatively more labor intensive or employment intensive industries, which A, creates jobs, which is a good goal in itself, desirable goal in itself, but B, also enables a correction of the distribution of income. By pushing up wages at the bottom, potentially you are decreasing inequality, you are increasing consumption at the bottom again, in the bottom decile, so let's say the bottom half, where consumption takes the form of relatively more capital-intensive commodities, garments, footwear, furniture, other things like that, which has a positive feedback loop because that demand increase was then going to improve the output and productivity of those labor-intensive industries, thereby creating more jobs. So you have a potential negative feedback loop that comes from inequality and capital intensity, locks you into a enclave type of growth, and many people have raised the concern that the Indian economy could be going that path, or you have a virtuous cycle. And where industrial policy sits is that it has the potential power to shift the balance of growth from relatively more capital-intensive sectors to relatively more labor-intensive sectors.
And my other point about your assessment of the nature of domestic capital, and in fact, I want to add one more to that, is your assessment of the political economy of the state.
Right. I think both are, again, central questions to industrial policy. If we take a step back and see what do we know about how industrial policy has worked in other late industrializers, and here the archetypal sort of case is South Korea, but potentially one can also look at Taiwan, one can look at China and other places. You see a kind of close relationship between the state and business in all of these examples. In other words, there is no actually existing economy where the state is at arm's length with capital, particularly big capital. They are indeed very close. What is different perhaps maybe from country to country, and this also goes to whether industrial policy succeeds or not, is does the state have the capacity to take actions which potentially hurt the interests of capital if the actions of capital are not aligned to the state's own long-term vision for the economy. And in Korea, that's what we see, that there is a very cozy relationship. There is corruption, there is favoritism, all of this exists. You can also call it crony capital if you wish, but the state does have the capacity to deploy the stick and not just the carrot, and to deploy it in a way that is not arbitrary or retrospective. Because that's the other thing that in India we have seen, that the state can come down on capital, but it often is arbitrary or it's retrospective, and which erodes the trust between capital and the state, and of course that is bad. So the relationship is often close. The question is, are there checks and balances, or is there freedom that the state has to execute its own agenda? And in the Indian case, perhaps we have seen a lot less of that than we have in other countries. So Indian big capital and the Indian form of crony capitalism maybe does not have that same dynamism with respect to the larger goals of the Indian economy. I mean, the particular favored businesses may be very dynamic. They may see huge increases in profitability and so forth, but does that relate to any broader societal goal or not? That depends on whether the state has the capacity to act against them if they are going against the broader interests. And that I don't think we have necessarily seen in India.
And would you like to comment on the relationship between the state and globally mobile capital with respect to industrial policy?
Right. So here, the desire for foreign direct investment, we'll set aside portfolio investment because that's really not relevant to the discussion and is not really developmentally a very welcome thing, except of course that in India's case our balance of payment is balanced through those flows, but we'll set that aside for now. Let's say we are talking about foreign direct investment and not portfolio investment, then the desire to attract that investment has translated into rolling out of all kinds of concessions for foreign capital, because the expectation is that it will come, it will bring in technology, it will bring in jobs and competitiveness and so forth, and through subcontracting and production networks, it will enable a upskilling and upscaling of the Indian economy, all of which can happen. But it may not happen also, because the goals of foreign capital are, of course, profitability of its own shareholders, not domestic development. So the challenge that the state faces here is to devise contracts or agreements with respect to foreign capital that open the country up for that capital to operate from here and to get the benefits, whether it's taxes, whether it's land, whatever laws they are, but in exchange has conditions attached to it which enable the upskilling and upscaling of domestic producers. So you get those spillover effects, and it doesn't remain an enclave where inputs are imported, they're assembled and exported, and you really don't even see local employment, maybe a little bit, but hardly any effects on local suppliers. That part of ensuring that we're giving you all of these things, but in exchange you have to give us this. Really, I think is where industrial policy succeeds or fails.
No, thanks for drawing attention to the importance of government policy towards global capital flows in the overall industrial policy. It does indeed play an important role. Now, if we may turn to something that you've written about quite often, which is the importance of structural change. And so it'll be great if you can define structural change. And when you say that economic policy needs to combine the outcomes of growth and structural change. And once you define it, if you could tell me, how should industrial policy be reconfigured to be able to deliver more effectively on the structural change that you think is so very important?
Right. So let's start with structural change. This is a term that goes back many decades in development economics, and it refers to a change in the structure of the economy away from a largely subsistence-oriented production to a modern capitalist economy. And this transition, sometimes just called industrialization, means sort of similar things. This transformation is really the only way that we have seen in history that economies have left the sort of subsistence floor trap and become productive dynamic economies where standards of living rise consistently over time. Now, I'm saying this is the only way we have known, because hopefully in the last few minutes we will talk about, are there other ways of thinking of this? How do we do it? Or are we beholden to what in the past has happened? But for a moment, let's say what, we are following the playbook of the past. Then structural change is about this thing. How do we reduce the preponderance of what is called surplus labor, by which is meant workers who, if they were to be relocated to different activities, the output of the sectors from which they have left would not suffer. So there are ways of producing the same amount of output with fewer people, while the people that have left are doing other things, presumably more higher productivity things. That's structural change. The presence of surplus labor it's not just about the overall productivity only, it's also about working conditions for the majority of people. So it's really a very bread and butter concern, if you will, that as long as there's surplus labor in the economy, the working conditions of those who have employment are tied to the existence of that surplus labor. So to give a concrete example, if I have a job, and if I lose that job, there are 10 more people ready to take that job, then I am very insecure in that job. My bargaining position is very weak. No amount of legislation that protects me can really protect me, because employers understand the fact that there are many people willing to work in these current conditions. So the attempt to improve those conditions is met by a subverting of the law. Now, if you don't want that to happen, you need a state that is extremely proactive and pro-labor and comes down hard on employers who circumvent that legislation, which in capitalism is very hard because, as we spoke about earlier, employers are very close to the state. So getting an employer agenda through the state is far easier than getting a worker agenda. That doesn't mean that worker legislation is useless, obviously not. It is very much needed, but it can't do anything in and of itself. Structural transformation is that background against which labor laws and other legislation acquire the teeth that they should have. Industrial policy's goal is then to achieve that elimination of surplus labor through structural transformation, thereby strengthening labor's bargaining position and improving the working conditions for the majority. Needless to say, industrial policy will not be able to deliver this if it is targeted towards sectors that do not generate enough jobs. So this brings up the important point that if you define industrial policy in narrow terms as either output growth or export growth, without paying attention to its employment dimension, then it doesn't achieve the broader societal goal. You may get, for example, a very competitive automobile sector, and India has a dynamic competitive automobile sector, but it's not a very large employer. Capital intensity in the sector ensures that that is not the case. Similarly for semiconductors or many other kinds of things where this may be a good industry to have a competitive edge in from the point of view of exports, earnings and other things, balance of payments and so forth, but they're not solving your employment problem. So industrial policy has to have the clarity of different goals, that if we are supporting this sector, it is for this purpose. And that problem is not going to be solved by this. We need a different set of policies for different set of sectors to achieve the employment goal than, let's say, the export goal. Of course, if they merge, that's the best case scenario, and that's what we've seen in East Asia and so forth, is where export competitiveness was achieved in labor-intensive industries, thereby killing two birds with one stone. That may or may not happen in every country, and I don't think it has to happen for industrial policy to enable.
The Indian government some years ago supported policies which led to the growth of the IT and IT-enabled services industry. And several of the pronouncements came that India could leapfrog, does not really have to pass through the manufacturing age and could directly get into the services age. What do you have to say? And indeed, there has been success. In fact, the growth of IT and IT-enabled IT-enabled services have contributed significantly to India's growth in the past 1.5 decades. But does this have the potential to contribute strongly to the structural transformation that you consider as extremely desirable for a country like India?
Yeah, I think this is a very hotly debated thing in India over the last decade. Every few months or years, there's some person who writes about, could it be a service-led transformation? Does it have to be manufacturing, and so forth? And this connects to the question you raised earlier about the changing global conditions under which each successive wave of industrialization occurs. So, for example, the premature deindustrialization thesis, coming from Danny Roderick and others, says that because the current wave of industrializers are trying to achieve industrialization in the backdrop of a large number of very productive and competitive existing economies, and couple that with relatively open trade policy, so not much protection and so forth, put those two together, and economies that do not have that productive capacity do not get a chance to develop it, because there is already many people out there who can do it much better than you. Why would you do it? And if you want to do it, you have to put those protections in place, which have been the standard playbook of late industrialization since the days of Britain. And so British industrialization in the 19th century did this, as did the Japanese later, as did the Koreans, the Chinese. Every successive wave has protected its market from more efficient producers for a limited amount of time to achieve that efficiency gain. Now, if countries today find it much harder to do that, the space to do that is shrunk, and the number of producers is far more, then what you get is this thesis or this phenomenon of premature deindustrialization, which is that the share of manufacturing starts falling much, much earlier than it ever did before. So in India, for example, people have also called it premature non-industrialization. I think this is Arvind Subramanian's phrase, because it just doesn't increase. It's sort of stuck at 10 or 12% of employment and about 14 or 15% of GDP, and it doesn't move. Now, in this global environment, what are the options? So naturally, the mind is drawn towards other sectors. Does it have to be manufacturing? Can it be something else? And one way to, I think about this is, what is it about manufacturing that makes it special? Why should it be manufacturing? And there, the standard answer in development economics goes back either to a Kaldor laws kind of perspective, which is that manufacturing has more linkages with other sectors. So growing manufacturing means growing productivity in other sectors. Manufacturing is tradable, so therefore it's not limited to the domestic market. Most services are not. So perhaps a productive analytical distinction is between industries that demonstrate a certain set of qualities, such as tradability, productivity increases, and so on, and industries that don't. Manufacturing will be always in this category, but so will some services. And IT/ITES is an excellent example of that. Services that are high productivity and tradable. The question is, are they also employment intensive? Because that's the other thing that manufacturing has, potentially. And here, unfortunately, the answer is no. There has been rapid growth in IT/ITES, let's say output-wise. Also, in terms of employment growth, it has been high, but the base was very low to begin with, so you had a high growth. And in terms of absolute numbers, it's nowhere close to where you'd like it to be. We're talking about single-digit millions in a workforce of 500 million, with a non-farm sector of, let's say, 300 million. So we're talking about less than 10 million people in that. For IT to have that kind of impact, and just to give the listeners perspective, construction employs around 50 to 60 million people in India. Right? So it's about 5 to 8 times what IT employs. For IT to go there, we're talking about huge increases in output, which it's not clear to me will happen. Of course, I haven't seen the future, so I don't know. So I think the pragmatic answer, to cut a long story short for me, is really it's a sterile debate to say, is it going to be manufacturing? Is it going to be services? We should have clarity on which industries will deliver what goal for us. There are going to be industries that deliver the balance of payments export goal. There are going to be industries that deliver spillover effects and productivity growth. There are going to be industries that deliver job growth. They need not be the same industries. So we need that clarity and say we are supporting this for this purpose and this for this purpose. And finally, to bring it around to policy space, Danny Roderick made this point a few years ago, that could it be that developing countries just imagine the space to be much smaller than it actually is? Have you tested how far you can go with setting policies that work for you, and then see if it happens? Why preempt? And I think a lot of the times the battle is lost in the ideology, that we believe in the first place that it should, every trade distortion is a distortion and has to be explained. Right? But maybe that should be your starting point. That my starting point is my trade policy is for domestic industries. I will relax it if need be. So that's a different way of looking at it, and we should be doing that.
That's great to hear. Let me turn to something else that you've been working on. You've been exploring the potential for the unorganized sector to be dynamic, to be able to rapidly increase productivity, to be able to grow as well. Can you consider industrial policy instruments which could help the unorganized sector, be it in manufacture or be it in services, to transform itself so that it can address the societal goals that you referred to earlier?
Absolutely. I think, in fact, we don't have a choice in the matter. We have to do this. what gets in the way, I think, is that in the policy imagination, sometimes even in the academic imagination, industrial policy is about big business, it's about big industry and so forth. And when one talks about micro enterprises or small enterprises and so on in the unorganized sector, then our mind shifts to welfare, poverty, and those kinds of things, which of course is relevant. I'm not saying that one should not think about welfare or poverty, but these informal businesses are at least as much in need of strategic thinking that comes from the space of industrial policy, right? Than just thinking of them as livelihood enterprises. I think this is the key shift that needs to happen. Indeed, the vast majority of unorganized activity is livelihoods, is subsistence. There's no doubt about that. But there's a significant chunk of the unorganized sector that is not subsistence activity. These are enterprises that employ 5 people, 10 people, and so forth, who are not registered, who are not on the radar as far as large businesses go, but they are dynamic, meaning that they're interested in accumulation and growth. They have the potential to grow if supported in the right way. So industrial policy that supports this segment of the firm landscape is absolutely key for few different reasons. One, the employment intensity is likely to be higher here, meaning that for a given amount of output growth, you may create more jobs here than you would in the large sector, which tends to be a lot more capital intensive. So you get that. It's far more broad-based and regionally spread out. So you're talking about every part of the country that can participate in that growth, and not just those parts which already have big businesses or factories operating in them. That's the second. It is far more of an inclusive space when it comes to traditional sort of hierarchies in India, whether it is gender, whether it is caste, whether it is religion. The unorganized sector has far many more entrepreneurs and workers from diverse backgrounds than does the corporate sector. So growth there, again, impacts far many more diverse people. And finally, it is that sector which is mostly the carrier of cultural identity as far as output goes. So we're talking about industrial clusters in the hundreds all over India that produce food products, textiles, metalware, many other commodities that are linked to the identity of India. We are used to thinking of them as craft or artisan and so on, but they're really industrial clusters. And if we think of them from the point of view of how they have been imagined in, let's say, places like Italy and other countries, then these are heritage goods and industries that can become modern dynamic industries, and that can get converted into something that is perhaps no longer even recognizable as having those roots, but it comes from there. The knowledge comes from there, the capital comes from there, the networks come from there, and so on. So for all these reasons, culture and heritage, inclusivity, regional spread, and employment, having industrial policy that enables the scale-up of these unorganized industrial clusters is absolutely essential.
Thank you. That's quite convincing. Let me now turn to how what you've shared in terms of the nature of the state, the desirability of industrial policy, the preeminence of a social goal such as structural transformation, the tools, intervention in markets. What do all of these collectively, how do they question the theoretical paradigm which is dominant in economics these days, which is based fundamentally on neoclassical economics? If you could just share with us 2 or 3 major themes on which these could pose a challenge and force economists to go back to the drawing board. Can you please share that with us?
A few years ago, there was an IMF working paper that was published, the International Monetary Fund, whose title was The Return of the Policy That Shall Not Be Named. And that was industrial policy. And the reason I think it was titled so was because there was a growing interest in industrial policy instruments all over the world, coupled actually with the deglobalization moment as well, as you might expect. But nevertheless, a return compared to the kind of years spent in the wilderness as far as the I would say the commanding heights of policy and academy go, because I don't think industrial policy ever went away. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, something like special economic zones is industrial policy. Any policy that the government undertakes which specifically targets sectors or industries and enables them to grow, whether it's taxes, land, labor, whatever your axis you're working on, trade, it's industrial policy. So that never went away. Countries were doing it constantly all the time. What had changed was the respectability in the academy and in the commanding heights of the legitimacy of these as being things that one can do without, let's say, hurting everyone. So that would be the standard economics argument, is that you are going to come in and distort a market. You think you're benefiting these people, helping them grow. You're going to have knock-on effects of all kinds. You don't know them. You can't pick winners, as it's called, because you don't know what's going to be the future. You're the government. Private entrepreneurs are much better at knowing what opportunities exist, moving in there and so forth. You should enable them to do this in the most hands-off way possible. So that could be something as basic as clear contract enforcement, property rights, public infrastructure, and enforcement of laws, and get out of the way. Don't try to give a credit subsidy to textiles or give some land concessions to computers or whatever it is, because you don't know what is going to be the future industry and what is not. You will spend resources, scarce resources that are better spent elsewhere, and the returns are uncertain. This is the standard kind of way that you would teach it to students and so forth as well. The problem with this view is that no country did this. And more importantly, no country that successfully industrialized did that. Of course, many countries that did this did not successfully industrialize. So there's no necessity, claim being made here. It's not that if you do all of this stuff and you distort the markets this way, you're guaranteed success. No. But if you work backwards and see who did successfully industrialize, they all did this. Right? So the causality is, you have to be careful about it. But there is no known case of an economy that pursued fully free market policies, did only the basics of the Washington Consensus, and successfully industrialized. That did not happen in history. So the catching up of the academy and so forth, I think, is more or less just that. It's catching up to what was the reality of policy. And that, in any case, I think, is how academy functions. It is always a step behind what real people are doing in the real world, solving problems. And I think the mistake is in thinking that we can think up that way of doing things and then sort of transmit it and give real problem solvers away. That is not to say that people who are doing the problem solving are always right, but they are figuring things out by trial and error. They are usually smart enough to figure out what hasn't worked and what hasn't worked. What gets in the way is not, I think, lack of knowledge so much as political economy. That you might know certain things need to be done, but are you going to be able to do them or not is a completely different question. And that's where the failure has happened. That governments would have known this is wrong, this should not be happening, our subsidies are being misspent in this way, or this legislation is being misused in that way, but do we have the ability to shut it down? And that goes back to my earlier carrot and sticks thing, that if the state has that autonomy, then it is able to achieve those goals. If it doesn't, then it can't.
Thank you very much, Professor Amit Basole, for this fascinating discussion.